Hello there, viewers. I've got a quick question for you. Have you ever heard a piece of news that made you completely rethink your opinion of someone? Drop your answer in the comments. Today's revelation is massive. Diddy's own defense lawyer just quit the case, and the reason behind will definitely turn everything you thought you knew upside down. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Retainer. I had defended bad people before. The kind of men who didn't lose sleep over the lives they ruined, the crimes they committed, the people they left in their wake. Murderers, traffickers, men who understood that morality was just a word people used to make themselves feel better about their own sins. But they all had one thing in common. They wanted a lawyer, not a savior, someone who knew the game, played it well, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. And yet, when I was offered the Diddy case, something about it felt different. I first heard about the offer through an unmarked envelope slipped under my office door. No sender, no firm letterhead, just a single piece of high-quality parchment with a time, a place, and a number that made me pause mid-breath. 7 figures, up front, more to come if I saw the case through to trial. I had worked with high-profile clients before, but this was something else. The kind of money that didn't just hire a defense attorney, it owned one. The meeting was set at the Mandarin Oriental penthouse, a place where the walls smelled like old money and secrets. It wasn't the first time I had done business in a setting like that, but the second I stepped out of the elevator, I felt it, the shift in the air. Security was thick. 2 men in dark suits flanked the door, hands resting at their waists where their holsters sat concealed beneath their jackets. I barely made eye contact with them as I was led through the sleek marble hallway, past polished surfaces that reflected my face back at me in unnatural distortion. The penthouse was large, open, sterile, too clean, not the kind of place that was actually lived in, but a place people came to talk in private. The view stretched across the city skyline, but the mood inside felt airtight, suffocating. Diddy sat in the center of it all, posture relaxed, too at ease for a man facing the kind of charges he was. "You've come highly recommended." His voice was smooth, practiced, a man used to controlling a room without raising his tone. I didn't sit right away. I hear that a lot. I scanned the room quickly. Too many people were here. Some I recognized. Legal aides, financial advisors, the kinds of people who cleaned up messes in ways that didn't involve a courtroom. But others, they didn't belong. A man in the far corner, dressed sharp but silent, observing. A woman near the bar, not drinking, not typing on the phone in her hand, just listening. Diddy gestured toward the chair across from him. "You want a drink?" "I want to see the files." The room stilled. A few eyes darted to one another, silent exchanges that I wasn't supposed to notice. Diddy leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me the way a man sizes up a new car, checking for weak spots, for dents in the frame. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, one of his aides set a thick black binder down on the glass coffee table. The weight of it sent a soft thump through the surface. I'd seen my fair share of legal files, thousands of pages, witness lists, deposition transcripts, but this binder was different. No labels, no firm's insignia, no clear markings indicating it was meant to exist at all. I opened it. The first thing I noticed was the redactions, whole paragraphs of text blacked out, entire testimonies stripped of identifying details. These weren't simple omissions, they were surgical extractions, carefully placed to ensure certain truths never saw the light of day. I flipped further, my pulse quickening. Evidence logs, incomplete, surveillance footage, timeless missing, testimonies from individuals who, as far as the public record was concerned, didn't exist. "This isn't just a criminal case," I murmured. "This is something else." Diddy's smile didn't fade, but it didn't reach his eyes either. "You're a smart man," he said. "That's why I want you on this." I glanced back down at the files. This wasn't just about getting him acquitted. This was about controlling information, aerating the wrong pieces, keeping the right ones, ensuring that the story, his story, played out exactly the way it was supposed to. It wasn't unusual for clients to want narrative control, but this was meticulously curated reality bending. I set the binder down, my fingers drumming against the glass. This is high risk. Diddy nodded. That's why I pay well. There was something unspoken in the air, a warning disguised as an offer. I picked up the pen on the table and signed the contract. Not because I fully trusted this, not because I thought it would be easy, but because if I didn't, someone else would. And I needed to understand exactly what I had just stepped into. The night after the meeting, I drove home in silence, my mind replaying everything in slow motion. The eyes watching me from the corners of that room. The missing details in the files. The way Diddy's men had reacted when I asked to see the evidence. I pulled into my driveway, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment, breathing in the silence. Then I saw it. A black SUV. Parked just down the street, no headlights on, no movement inside, just sitting there. Watching. I didn't move right away. I just kept my hands on the wheel, staring at the faint outline of the vehicle against the dark. Was it one of Diddy's people? A silent message? A reminder that I was now in the circle? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't know, and that was what bothered me the most. Chapter 2. Behind closed doors. By the time I stepped into the first official strategy meeting, I already knew I was dealing with something far beyond a simple legal defense. The room was in a downtown high-rise, a nondescript office space with blackout windows and an air of deliberate detachment. No company logos, no receptionist, just a single security guard who barely glanced up as I walked past. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The table was long, mahogany, too polished for a room that felt like it had seen more threats than discussions. Seated around it were Diddy's inner circle, his legal team, financial strategists, and two men who didn't bother to introduce themselves. Their suits were sharp, their expressions unreadable, the kind of men who didn't need to say much to make their presence known. Diddy was already there, leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily against the wood. His watch caught the light, a diamond-studded statement of power. He glanced up as I entered, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Now that we're all here," he said, voice smooth as ever, "let's get to work." The first 20 minutes were standard legal preparation, jury selection strategies, pre-trial motions, the usual procedural chess game. But then the discussion shifted, and I quickly realized this wasn't about building a traditional defense. "This needs to be controlled," one of the unnamed men said, his voice flat, mechanical. "We're not just worried about the charges, we're worried about what comes with them." The room fell into a quiet hum, unspoken agreements passing between glances. Diddy leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his expression sharpening. "You understand what's at stake, right?" His eyes were locked on me now. "This isn't just about me. It's about everything attached to me." I had heard variations of that statement before. Clients who believed their downfall meant the collapse of entire industries, reputations, legacies. But this was different. This wasn't just self-preservation. There was something deeper beneath the words. A foundation built on fear rather than arrogance. One of the legal aides slid a stack of documents toward me. I thumbed through them, my eyes scanning the first page. NDAs. Not unusual. But then I flipped to the next section, and my pulse slowed. These weren't standard contracts meant to keep employees or business associates from running to the tabloids. These were testimonies, sealed under private agreements, names and details that weren't just confidential, they shouldn't have existed at all. One stood out immediately. The name was redacted, but the accusations were chilling. A witness who had been scheduled to testify in another case years ago, only to withdraw under sudden and suspicious circumstances. The kind of testimony that, if resurfaced, could unravel everything. I glanced up. "You're expecting me to bury this?" The silence in the room stretched, heavy and absolute. Diddy didn't answer right away. He studied me, fingers still drumming, that unreadable expression on his face. Then he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Bury?" he repeated. "Nah. We don't bury things, we redirect." A lawyer to his left, a woman with sharp features and even sharper instincts, spoke up. "It's not about making things disappear. It's about ensuring the right narrative takes precedence. People believe what they're told to believe. We make sure the right story is told." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was the kind of maneuvering I had expected walking into this case, but the casual ease with which they spoke about it unsettled me. This wasn't a legal strategy. This was a mechanism. The meeting continued, but the more I listened, the more it became clear some people at this table were just as trapped as I was. One of the legal aides avoided eye contact the entire time, his hands trembling slightly whenever he took notes. Another man, one of the financial strategists, kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Not everyone in that room was in control. Some of them were simply trying to survive the machine they were a part of. By the time I left, my head was buzzing with questions I didn't have the answers to. The black binder from the penthouse meeting had been one thing, but these sealed testimonies, these nameless figures hiding in the margins of legal documents, that was something else entirely. That night, back at my office, I sat at my desk, the city skyline stretching beyond the window. The files from the meeting were in front of me, the weight of them pressing into my gut. I had dealt with high-profile cases before, cases that required maneuvering, careful wording, well-placed legal loopholes. But this was something else. The thought hadn't fully settled before I noticed something on my desk that hadn't been there when I left. An envelope. No postage, no return address. I reached for it slowly, the paper crisp beneath my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting jagged, hurried, as if written by someone who hadn't had the luxury of time. "You don't know what you've stepped into. You're not defending a man. You're defending something much older." The words sat heavy in my chest, sinking deeper with each second. I read it again, then again. Outside, a car engine hummed softly. I turned my head just in time to see the black SUV from the night before slip down the street, disappearing into the dark. Chapter 3: The Man Who Knew Too Much. I was still staring at the letter when my phone rang. It was late. My office was silent except for the hum of the city beyond the windows, distant sirens cutting through the night. I glanced at the caller ID. No. Number. I hesitated. After everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, I had learned to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming at me to let it ring. But something in the air felt heavier than before. The weight of the documents in front of me, the cryptic message on my desk, the car outside that had vanished into the dark. None of it sat right. I picked up. At first, nothing, just silence. Not dead air, not static, but something else. A kind of deliberate stillness, as if someone was on the other end, listening, measuring whether or not to speak. Then, finally, a voice. Low, measured, strained. "You don't know me," the caller said, "but I know you, and I know what they hired you to do." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. And who exactly is they? A bitter chuckle. If you have to ask that, you're already in deeper than you realize. I pushed back from my desk, running a hand through my hair. I could feel my pulse against my temple, that slow, familiar thud that came when my brain was trying to put together pieces that didn't fit. The voice continued. "I used to be where you are, sitting at that desk, thinking I had control, thinking I could play the game." A pause. But this isn't a case, and you're not a lawyer in their eyes. You're a containment strategy. The words settled into my chest like a rock. Containment. Not defense, not damage control. Containment. I leaned forward, gripping the armrest of my chair. Who are you? Another pause, then quieter this time, almost reluctant. I was one of them. I sat at those meetings. I held the files in my hands. I helped write the NDAs, bury the testimonies, move the money, until I became a liability. I felt my stomach tighten. And now? Now, I don't exist. The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could speak, the caller exhaled sharply. Listen to me. You think you're building a defense. You think you're getting ahead of this, but they already know the outcome. That's not what you're here for. You're here to keep certain things from seeing the light of day, to slow things down, misdirect, make sure people look in the wrong places. I thought back to the sealed testimonies from the meeting, the names that had been erased, the evidence logs that didn't line up. The caller kept going. Did you know that some of the original witnesses are gone? I frowned. Gone where? A dry laugh. If you have to ask, you wouldn't like the answer. Something cold ran down my back. The caller's tone shifted. Some of them were paid off, others were neutralized. I sat up straighter. Neutralized? They don't expect you to win, the voice murmured. They expect you to keep secrets. Silence filled the space between us. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The room suddenly felt too big, too empty, too exposed. The caller exhaled, as if coming to a decision. I'm not calling to scare you. I'm calling to warn you. Another pause. They already have a file on you. They know your routine. They know your weaknesses. If you keep pushing, they're going to test how far you can be bent before you break. I felt my mouth go dry. Why are you telling me this? I asked. The caller hesitated, then, because I had someone warn me once, and I didn't listen. A beat, then the line went dead. The office was too quiet after the call. My hands were still resting on my desk, my fingers stiff. I needed to step back, to think. The weight of the last few days had started to creep into my bones, that deep, lingering exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but mental. I stood, stretching my arms before moving toward the door. The hall was dark as I stepped out into it, the faint hum of the ventilation system the only sound in the building. The security cameras blinked in the corners, small red eyes watching. I turned the lock behind me before heading toward the elevator. I told myself I was going home, that I needed to get some distance, that I wasn't rattled, that this was just another case, just another wealthy man trying to pull strings, trying to use the system in ways that benefited him. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't just a case. I reached the parking garage, stepping into the dim glow of the overhead fluorescence. My car was parked near the far corner, one of the only vehicles left at this hour. The silence of the space pressed in around me, thick and heavy. I opened my car door, but something made me stop. A sound. Soft, faint, the click of a lock. My office. I turned, my eyes narrowing toward the elevator. Someone was inside. I moved quickly, stepping back toward the shadows of the garage, pressing my body against the cold cement pillar. My breathing slowed, my pulse pounded against my ribs. Then, footsteps. Faint, measured. They weren't running, they weren't panicked. They were calm. Whoever had entered my office wasn't looking to steal anything. They weren't ransacking my space, searching for valuables. They were looking for something specific. I stayed where I was, waiting. A full minute passed. Then another. Finally, the footsteps retreated. The click of the lock echoed again, and then silence. I forced myself to wait another few minutes before moving. Then, cautiously, I made my way back toward the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. When I reached my office, I pressed my hand against the door. The knob turned easily. Unlocked. I stepped inside. The space was untouched. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My desk, my chair, the files stacked neatly in their place. Except for one. A single case file was missing. The one I hadn't read yet. The weight of the realization settled in my gut like lead. They hadn't taken money, they hadn't wiped my computer or gone through my personal records. They had come for something very specific, something I wasn't supposed to see. I turned slowly, glancing toward the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, glittering in the distance, bright and endless. But standing there, staring into the night, I didn't feel like I was looking at freedom. I felt like I was looking at a cage. And for the first time since taking this case, I realized that I wasn't just defending Diddy. I was trapped inside something much bigger than him. Chapter 4. A Deal with the Devil. There was no official invitation, no scheduled meeting on a calendar, no paper trail. I received a single message on a burner phone I hadn't been given by Diddy's team, but by someone above them. It vibrated against my desk late in the evening, a text without a sender, without an identity. Tomorrow, 11 p.m., the Churchill, room 604. No security, no phones. That was it. No pleasantries, no signature. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. Something had shifted. Up until now, everything about this case had felt controlled. Tense, yes, but still operating within a system. The meetings, the sealed documents, the calculated silences, all of it had played by a certain set of rules. But this wasn't a legal strategy session. This was something else. I didn't reply. There was no number to reply to. The Churchill was one of those places that didn't officially exist. It was a hotel, sure, but not one you could book online. No front desk, no lobby bar, no concierge smiling behind a polished counter. It was the kind of place where rooms were rented by the year, not by the night. The kind of place that had no security cameras. When I arrived, the doorman, if you could call him that, barely acknowledged me. He was built like a bouncer, dressed in a crisp black suit, his hands clasped in front of him as he stood by the entrance. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't check a list. He just looked at me, nodded once, and stepped aside. The elevator ride up to the 6th floor felt slower than it should have. Each floor blinked past with an unnatural rhythm, a long pause between each ding. By the time I reached 604, I felt like I had traveled much farther than 6 stories. I knocked once. No response. I waited. Then a soft click as the lock disengaged. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, bathed in the golden glow of a single floor lamp in the corner. The windows were blacked out, covered with heavy curtains, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke and something colder beneath it. Polished leather, old wood, money. A single man sat in the armchair across the room, his face cast in shadow. He wasn't wearing a suit like the others. His clothes were simple but calculated. Cashmere sweater, tailored slacks, the kind of understated wealth that spoke louder than a Rolex. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. I knew power when I saw it. "Sit," he said. I didn't argue. The chair across from him was positioned deliberately, not too close, not too far, the kind of space that allowed for conversation, but not comfort. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just studied me. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're asking the wrong questions." His voice was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that had never had to raise itself to be heard. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't realize I was asking any at all. A small smirk. "That's the problem. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His eyes weren't just assessing me. "You're here because this isn't about a trial," he said. "It's about maintaining a system." I didn't move. He continued, "This case doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't begin and end with Sean Combs. It's part of something larger. A network. A structure that's been in place for longer than you've been alive. And your job, counselor, isn't to win or lose." He let the words settle. "Your job is to make sure it holds." The air in the room thickened. I had heard variations of this speech before. Clients who thought they were untouchable, men who believed their wealth or connections made them immune to consequences. But this wasn't arrogance. This was certainty. I exhaled slowly. "And if I don't?" He smiled. "Then you won't be part of the system anymore." A pause. "That doesn't mean jail. It doesn't mean a scandal." He tilted his head slightly. "It means erasure." I met his gaze. "You mean like the witnesses?" For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Amusement, or maybe approval. "Now you're asking the right questions," he murmured. The room felt colder than when I had entered. He leaned back again, adjusting his cuff. "Some cases aren't defended with facts. They're defended with power. The question is, do you understand that?" I stared at him. I understood. I just didn't know if I wanted to. I left the Churchill at 1:13 a.m. I didn't speak to anyone on the way out, didn't acknowledge the doorman, didn't look over my shoulder, but I felt it. The presence behind me. By the time I reached my car, my pulse was still steady, but my thoughts weren't. I wasn't defending a client, I was defending something much bigger. And I needed to know exactly what that meant. When I got home, I went straight to my laptop. The financial documents from the case were encrypted, buried under layers of security, but nothing was ever truly hidden. I started with the offshore accounts. The first was expected: standard shell companies, fake holding corporations, the kind of wealth laundering I had seen 100 times before. But then I found something else. A link between an account in the Cayman Islands and a dead corporation that had dissolved over a decade ago. A company that, according to public record, had never turned a profit. But the numbers didn't match. The funds were still active, and the names attached to them weren't supposed to be linked. A politician, a media executive, a name I recognized from the private strategy meetings. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. About making sure the right people had power and that no one could challenge them. I leaned back, staring at the screen, my hands suddenly feeling colder than before. This wasn't just about Diddy. He was just a part of the network, and I had just gotten my first glimpse of the machine that had been running behind the scenes for years. For the first time, I wondered if it was too late to turn back. Chapter 5. The paranoia sets in. I had spent my entire career navigating power, understanding it, manipulating it. I knew how it worked, how to bend it, how to use it to my advantage. I thought I had seen everything. I was wrong. Something had shifted after the Churchill meeting. It wasn't just the way people looked at me, like I had stepped too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. It was the silence. The kind that stretched just a little too long when I walked into a room. The way conversations fizzled out mid-sentence when I was near. The first time my phone glitched, I didn't think much of it. I was on a call with one of my associates discussing the next steps in discovery when the line went dead. No static, no beeping, just an abrupt, silent cutoff. I pulled the phone away from my ear, frowned at the screen. No service. That was odd. My office had perfect reception. A few seconds later, the screen flashed black, then rebooted itself. When I tried to call back, the number had been wiped from my call log. That was when the unease started to settle deep in my gut. By the end of the week, my emails started disappearing. Not junk mail, not spam, important ones. Files my legal team had forwarded, communications about court motions, drafts of arguments we were preparing, all of them gone. At first I thought it was a system error. I contacted IT, but they insisted nothing was wrong. No logs of deletion, no data breaches, just empty spaces where information used to be. And then there was the car. The same black SUV I had seen outside my house. It started showing up everywhere. At first I told myself it was a coincidence, plenty of black SUVs in the city. But then it began to move when I moved. I'd leave my office at night and it would pull out 2 cars behind me. I'd stop at a red light, check my mirror, and it would be there, a shadow at the edge of my periphery. One night I tested it, took an unnecessary detour through side streets, weaving through neighborhoods I had no business being in. It followed. Never too close, never aggressive, just there, watching. I took a sharp right onto a side street and pulled over, cutting the engine. My hands clenched the wheel, my heart beat steady but deliberate. I waited. The SUV didn't pass. Instead, it slowed to a crawl at the intersection, pausing just long enough to let me know it saw me. Then, just as casually, it rolled forward and disappeared into the night. I sat there for a long time before finally starting the car again. I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly for an hour, circling through different streets, waiting to see if it would return. It didn't, but somehow that made it worse. The next morning, I decided to reach out to people I trusted, or at least people I had trusted before. I called an old mentor of mine, a former prosecutor who had transitioned into private defense, a man who had built his career on handling cases like these. The first time, he didn't answer. The second time he picked up, but his tone was different, distant, guarded. "I can't talk," he said immediately. "Since when?" I asked. A pause, then flatly, "Since you took that case." I pressed the phone harder to my ear. "So, you know." Another pause. "I know enough." Something was off. This was a man who had defended murderers, corrupt politicians, organized crime bosses. He had never been one to back down from a fight. But now he sounded like a man who had seen the end of the road and decided it wasn't worth the drive. "I just need to know what I'm dealing with," I said carefully. "No," he replied, quick, urgent. "You don't." The call ended. I tried others. One by one, they stopped answering. Some avoided my calls altogether. Others gave clipped responses, suddenly busy or out of town. One friend, someone I had once trusted implicitly, picked up and before I could even speak, simply said, "Walk away while you still can." Then he hung up. The weight of it all pressed against my chest. The network of people I had built, the connections I had spent years cultivating, suddenly they were gone. Not because I had burned bridges, but because someone else had already lit the match. The final straw came later that evening. I was back in my office, exhausted, my mind stretched thin from trying to make sense of it all. The paranoia had settled in like a second skin. The city lights glowed through my window, painting long shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. An unmarked envelope. Not placed in my mailbox, not left with my secretary. Sitting in the middle of my desk. I hadn't been gone long. Whoever had put it there had access. My throat tightened as I reached for it. The paper felt thicker than standard legal documents, expensive. I slid my thumb under the fold, breaking the seal. Inside was a sealed court document. I unfolded it. My breath slowed. It was blank, not redacted, not partially censored, completely empty. The pages were there, the watermark official, the formatting identical to any other case file I had handled. But there were no words, no names, no motions. Just an empty file that shouldn't have existed. At the bottom of the last page, in small, precise handwriting, was a single note. "Walk away while you still can." My fingers curled around the paper, the weight of it pressing against my palm like a physical warning. This wasn't just about intimidation. This was about control. They wanted me to know that I had no power here, that my office, my home, my life, it was all accessible to them. That whatever lines I thought existed between my career and my survival were nothing more than illusions. I looked toward the window. The night beyond was vast and indifferent, the city humming with a pulse of its own. I wasn't just trapped. I was owned. And for the first time, I wondered if walking away was even an option anymore. Chapter 6. The Missing Witness. I had barely slept. The words on that blank document haunted me. Walk away while you still can. The problem was, I didn't know if I still could. I had spent my career understanding leverage, how to apply it, how to manipulate it, how to recognize when I didn't have any, and now for the first time, I was the one being played. That morning I forced myself into routine, showered, shaved, put on the same tailored suit that used to make me feel untouchable. It didn't work this time. The fabric felt like a disguise, a costume for a man who was slipping through the cracks of his own life. I made it to my office just past 8 a.m. My assistant wasn't there yet, which made sense. I hadn't hired one, not for this case. I had deliberately chosen to keep my staff out of it. No one needed to get tangled in this mess but me. I went through emails, nothing substantial, no new case updates, no messages from the legal team. Then a name caught my eye. A witness I had been prepping for cross-examination, someone crucial to the case. I clicked on the attachment, expecting deposition notes or a scheduling change. Instead, it was a short single-line email from an anonymous sender. "He's gone." I stared at the screen, the words refusing to make sense. "Gone?" I picked up my phone, dialing the last number I had for the witness. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. My stomach tightened. Witnesses went missing all the time in high-profile cases. Intimidations, payoffs, deals made in dimly lit parking garages. But this was different. This wasn't just a key witness, this was the witness. The one whose testimony could have unraveled everything. I needed to know more. I needed details. But the usual channels, law enforcement, private investigators, were useless here. I couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. And then, just when I thought my morning couldn't get worse, I saw it. Something was sitting on my doorstep. A small, nondescript package. Wrapped in plain brown paper, no postage, no markings. I stood in the doorway, staring down at it. The street was quiet, too quiet for a city that never really slept. I glanced around, my instincts screaming. I was being watched. The security cameras in my building had never been touched before. But now I wondered if they were pointed the other way when it mattered. I knelt, picked up the package. It was light. Tucked beneath the wrapping was a simple black USB drive. No note, no instructions, just the device. I went inside, shutting and locking the door behind me. I sat at my desk staring at the drive in my hand. I had options: destroy it, pretend I never saw it, or I could see what they wanted me to see. I exhaled slowly and plugged it into my laptop. The folder that popped up was empty except for a single video file. No title, no metadata, no timestamps. I clicked it. The screen flickered, and then grainy, distorted footage. A darkened parking garage, concrete pillars and dim fluorescent lights. At first, there was nothing. Then, movement in the shadows. 2 men, one of them on his knees. My breath slowed. It was the witness. I leaned in closer, my pulse a steady drum against my ribs. The video had no sound, just the flickering glow of the overhead lights and the jerky motion of the camera, as if it had been filmed in a hurry. The witness looked frantic. He was pleading. One of the men standing over him grabbed the collar of his shirt, shaking him once, not angry, not aggressive, just cold. A warning. The witness nodded. The man let go. And then, just like that, the video ended. I sat there, staring at the black screen. I didn't know if he was dead. But I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to testify. I ran a hand over my face, trying to slow my thoughts. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a message. A reminder that I wasn't here to win. I was here to stall, to bury, to ensure the right people stayed untouched. I stood abruptly, pacing. The walls of my office felt smaller now, the windows like two-way mirrors. I had to be careful, I had to think. But I didn't have time. A knock at the door made me freeze. 3 slow taps. I exhaled sharply, moving toward it, keeping my footsteps light. My fingers hovered over the doorknob before I pulled it open in one swift motion. The hallway was empty. But on the floor, right outside my office, was another envelope. My stomach clenched. I picked it up, stepped back inside, and opened it. A single piece of paper. If you leave now, it won't be your choice. I let the note fall from my fingers, my mind spinning. I was trapped. I couldn't just resign and walk away. I was in this case until they decided I wasn't. And if I wasn't careful, I wouldn't be walking away at all. Chapter 7. The Final Warning. I drove in silence, my grip tight around the steering wheel. The city blurred past me, neon lights and traffic signals bleeding together in a haze of red and white. I had chosen the meeting location myself, a place far from cameras, far from the eyes that I now knew were watching. An old bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that smelled like stale cigarettes and lost time. I hadn't been here in years, but I knew it would be empty at this hour. Inside, the bartender barely glanced up as I stepped in. A single overhead light flickered above the counter, casting long, uneven shadows across the wooden floor. At the far end of the room, a man sat in a booth, his back to the wall. He looked different than the last time I'd seen him. Older, harder, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from knowing too much for too long. His name wasn't important. Not anymore. He had worked in intelligence once, before he disappeared. Not officially. Officially, he had taken early retirement, but I knew better. I knew the kind of men who left that world, never really left. I slid into the seat across from him, setting my keys on the table. I need answers. He smirked, a dry, humorless thing. You finally figured it out, huh? I didn't respond. He sighed, rubbing his hands together before leaning in slightly. His voice was quiet when he spoke. They're watching you. A chill ran down my spine. I figured as much, I said, keeping my voice steady. He shook his head. No, you don't get it. This isn't the usual surveillance. This isn't cops tracking a suspect or a firm keeping tabs on an employee. This is different. I waited. He exhaled slowly, studying me. Your phone? Monitored. Your emails? Gone before you even see half of them. Your office? He tilted his head slightly. They don't need to break in anymore. They already have what they need. I swallowed, my pulse steady but too slow, too deliberate. Who are they? His expression darkened. You think you're defending a man, he said. You're not. You're standing in front of a system that doesn't let people walk away. I clenched my jaw. Then why am I still here? He let out a small breath of amusement. Because they're not done with you yet. I leaned forward. I need specifics. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket, slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I unfolded it. A list of names. Some I recognized. Diddy's associates, his legal team. But others, Others weren't supposed to be involved. Judges, investigators, politicians. My stomach tightened. "This case," he said, "isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about maintenance. They don't care what happens in court. They care about what stays hidden." I clenched the paper in my hand. "And if I walk?" His eyes met mine. "You." Silence stretched between us. Then he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Listen, I wouldn't be here if I thought you had a way out." He lowered his voice. "You don't understand what you're caught up in. You need to leave." I stared at him. "And go where?" A flicker of something, regret maybe, crossed his face. "There's nowhere they can't reach you," he admitted. "But there are places where you might stay useful, and if you're useful, you stay alive." The words settled like a stone in my gut. He glanced at the clock behind the bar. "You should go." I nodded, sliding out of the booth. My mind was already working through scenarios, exit plans, ways to disappear. But deep down I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I pulled into my driveway a little after midnight. The house was dark, untouched, the same way I had left it. At least, that's what I thought. It wasn't until I stepped up to the front door that I noticed. The lock was off. Not broken, not obviously tampered with. Just wrong. I reached for the handle, turned it slowly. It opened too easily. My entire body tensed as I stepped inside. The air was still, unnaturally so. My house always had a faint hum. The fridge, the air conditioning, the distant city sounds bleeding through the walls. But now there was nothing. I moved carefully through the hallway, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. And yet, I knew someone had been here. It wasn't until I reached my office that I saw it. A manila folder, placed neatly in the center of my desk. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, staring at it. I already knew what was inside. Still, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the thick paper. I pulled it open, flipping it over. And there they were. Photographs. Not of me. Of my family. My brother, my mother, my niece. Candid shots, walking home, running errands, eating at a restaurant. Unaware, unprotected. A slow, heavy breath pushed from my lungs. I flipped through them one by one, my heartbeat a distant, steady thud. No threats, no written messages, just the pictures. The message was clear enough. I set the folder down carefully. Then I turned toward the window. The street outside was empty. But I knew better. I wasn't looking for the SUV anymore. Because the people watching me, they weren't outside. They were already inside. Chapter 8, The Resignation. I wrote the resignation letter in my office at dawn, the city still draped in the quiet hush before the morning traffic. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves knew I wasn't supposed to be doing this. My hands moved mechanically across the keyboard, typing out the same sterile language I had used countless times for clients who needed a quiet exit. Only this time, the letter was for me, effective immediately, no further comment. I read it over twice. It felt wrong, unnatural, like I was writing someone else's resignation, a weaker man's. But deep down, I knew that was just my pride trying to fight against the inevitable. This wasn't a choice anymore. It was survival. The paper slid smoothly from the printer, the ink still fresh, still real in a way that made my stomach twist. I had handled hundreds of legal documents, rewritten people's realities with a few well-placed paragraphs, buried lives under mountains of paperwork, but I had never felt the weight of a single sheet of paper like I did now. I tucked the letter into my briefcase, then leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My resignation wouldn't change anything, not really. The case would go on without me. The system would keep grinding forward, consuming people like it always had. But I needed out. I had convinced myself that this was still an option, that I hadn't reached the point of no return. Maybe that was true. Or maybe I was about to learn the hard way that men like me didn't just walk away from things like this. I left my office without looking back. The firm's main office was housed in a sleek glass-paneled building downtown, a place where deals were made behind conference room doors, where men in tailored suits shook hands over quiet agreements that never saw a courtroom. I had walked through these halls 1,000 times before, always with purpose, always in control. Today I felt like a ghost. No one stopped me as I walked past reception. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Normally there was a hum of activity, assistants on phones, attorneys discussing cases, the rhythm of power moving through the building. But today, it felt staged, like the office was waiting for me to leave. I handed my resignation letter to my senior partner. He didn't even open it, just glanced at the envelope, then at me, his face carefully neutral. "Personal matters," I said. His nod was slow, deliberate. "That's the statement we'll release." And that was it. No argument, no attempt to convince me otherwise, not even a question about why. I expected relief, but instead, a deep, uncomfortable certainty settled in my chest. They weren't surprised. They had been expecting this. I turned to leave, moving toward the elevators, toward the exit that would officially sever me from this case. I almost believed it was that easy. Almost. "You didn't think you could just leave, did you?" The voice stopped me cold. I turned slowly. Standing near the hallway leading to the executive conference room was one of Diddy's legal strategists. He wasn't a lawyer in the traditional sense. His job wasn't about arguing in courtrooms or drafting legal motions. He was one of the fixers. The men who didn't just manage problems, they erased them. He was smiling, not the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring. I forced my posture to stay neutral. I just resigned. He gestured casually toward the folder in my hand. "You resigned from the firm. But that's not the same as leaving." Something in my gut twisted. I had spent my career reading people, dissecting the smallest shifts in body language, the unspoken cues that told me when someone was lying, when someone was bluffing, when someone had already decided how things were going to play out. He wasn't bluffing. "We don't erase names," he said. "We just make sure they stay in the right places." I knew what he meant. This wasn't a threat, it was a reminder, a quiet, carefully phrased acknowledgement that I was still in this, whether I wanted to be or not. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I glanced down the hallway. Through the reflection in the glass walls, I saw 2 other men standing near the end of the corridor, not talking, watching. I turned back to the strategist. He didn't step in my way. He didn't have to. I walked past him, keeping my pace steady, my hands loose at my sides. The moment I stepped outside, the city felt different. The sounds of traffic, the honking, the blur of movement on the sidewalks, it all felt detached, like I was watching it from the outside in. I kept walking. I didn't go back to my office. I didn't go home, because neither of those places belonged to me anymore. By nightfall, I was in a hotel on the other side of town, a cheap, anonymous place. No cameras, no check-in records that couldn't be scrubbed. I had spent enough time defending criminals to know that if you wanted to disappear for a while, you stayed somewhere no one with power would be caught dead in. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. No calls, no messages. For the first time in weeks, my inbox was completely empty. That terrified me more than anything. The silence meant they weren't trying to persuade me anymore. They didn't need to. A soft buzz rattled against the nightstand. I froze. Not my phone. The burner phone? The one I had used for the Churchill meeting. The one that had only received one message before. The screen lit up. No number. No caller ID. I swallowed, my chest tightening. The message was short. You still know too much. The phone went dark, and I sat there, in that small, nameless hotel room, realizing the truth. I hadn't left anything behind. I had only stepped further in.